Hi folks, hope you're safe and well. Welcome to Lecture 7, The Rise of China. So this is the overall course plan for the International Political Economy course. And so for Lecture 7, this lecture will be concentrating mainly on the period from 97-ish to 2008-ish. With a little bit of background that's relevant, so Chinese Civil War and that sort of thing. And I want to cover three things. Firstly, I want to cover the 1990s currency crises and the Plaza and Louvre Accords, because they have a role to play in the story of the rise of China. Okay, so in 1979, the US, Volcker switches the US to high interest rates to fight inflation, but because the US was in a new, floating exchange rates environment since breaking the Bretton Woods system, increasing your interest rate draws investment dollars into your currency to get the higher interest rate, and this would normally drive up your currencies, and which it did, and so it drove the US dollar very high and further hurt its exports, and so the US threatened tariffs on the other members of the G5, and so that's Japan, Germany, France, and the UK. So the US threatens them with tariffs and maybe sort of withdrawing troops that defend them from the Soviets, and unless they agree to a coordinated increase in their currencies relative to the US, so a coordinated intervention in the markets to sell their currency, to sell US dollars and buy their currency, and drives the US dollar down in relative terms. So in 1985, the Plaza Accord is signed. So and this works, but there's a further agreement signed 2 years later, the Louvre Accord, where instead of just using intervening in the foreign exchange market, the Louvre Accord makes them also agree to using fiscal and monetary policy to clear trade imbalances, right? And the 1987 agreement wasn't actually implemented or agreed to even really until a draft of the agreement was leaked, and it spooked the markets so much that it caused the markets to tumble, and so Germany cut rates and US cut spending, and so so it was implemented as a way of bringing confidence back to the markets. So these accords worked, and they managed the global balance of payments, balance of trade, by managing the exchange rates of the G5 for 10 years, right? They kept deficits and surpluses, reasonably small, and managed this for 10 years. But then things changed with a series of crises where even the economic miracle countries, the Asian tigers, some of them find themselves in crisis due in part to short-term borrowing, but also because of the inherent instability of the new monetary system that has no capital controls, unlike the Bretton Woods system. So, the 1997 Asian currency crisis was really brought about by the removal of capital controls in the early 90s by nearly everyone, and the Asian tigers as well. And so, because of the export-driven growth of the Asian economies, and because they removed their capital controls, this saw a large influx of investment money, right? So inflows into the economy, and plus, so this really pumped up asset prices, caused asset bubbles, right? As as people found things to invest in these economies. Plus, the banks in these domestic banks, the Asian banks in these economies, borrowed short-term funds on the international markets at variable rates and in dollars, not in their own currency. They borrowed them on short-term rates, and then took them to their domestic market and lent them out on long-term real estate loans. So 30-year loans, right? But they've borrowed the money on quite short term, 6-month terms, or even less. So they were making a 3% profit, right? There was a 3% spread between what they could borrow and what they could lend at. But it exposed them to a huge risk if the short-term rates that they were borrowing on rose. So a real estate bubble bursts in Thailand, and a major bank collapses. And once the market loses confidence, then everyone becomes a speculator, and it spooks the entire region and goes from one market to another. And so by what do I mean by everyone becomes a speculator? What I mean is that even ma and pa investors, they can see that their currency is diving, so they want to get. So there is a chance to make some money if you sell your Korean won and buy US dollars, and the Korean won falls. When you convert it back into Korean won, you've gained more, right? You get more Korean won for your dollar. Right? So even ma and pa investors are buying US dollars to get their money out. International lenders refused to renew any short-term loans to the Thai banks in particular, and because the Thai banks had borrowed cheaply, but then on short term and lent it out on long term, they went bust. So the banks collapse, the real estate bubble pops, recessions, and then IMF structural adjustment plans and austerity. And we saw in the last lecture that having the IMF perform structural adjustment is not pleasant for anyone. So while several countries had a coordinated currency crisis in 1997, starting in Thailand, and it spread around the region as banks collapsed and markets got spooked, and so even the very strong economies of South Korea and Hong Kong got drawn into that. But this is actually part of a wider trend that we see in quite a few countries, right? So Mexico again kicking off a series of crises as they did in the 80s, but also a handful of other countries had the same problems. So the normal the normal story you're told is that they borrowed too much, and the governments ran ran deficits, all of which was on short-term loans, right? Because money was so cheap at the time, and that was probably a mistake, probably stupid, especially for the banks to borrow short and lend long. But for the governments, I'm not. There's still a big debate as to what they did wrong. I'm not sure if they did anything wrong, other than maybe it's a symptom of having no capital controls. You are exposed to the tide of international investment coming in and going out very quickly, and can cause a lot of pain. But regardless of the policy choices of the governments, it certainly made all of Asia very wary of foreign debt. And so if we go back to this slide, so in 1987 we had Germany, Japan, UK and France and the US reach an agreement to manage exchange rates so as to keep the current account balances reasonably low, right? So under 2%. And that worked for 10 years. But something changed after 1997, after the East Asian financial crisis, because you can see that the dollar strengthens significantly, right? So what changed? Well, what changed is we really move into a period that is sometimes called Bretton Woods II. What changed is that the East Asian countries quite rationally responded to the 1997 crash by returning to running large current account surpluses, right? So these are the funds from the surpluses that they're running are then used to build up a massive foreign reserves by buying government bonds, right? By buying US bonds and private bonds. So they had seen their economies wrecked by not having enough foreign currency to defend their fixed rate. So they swore they'd never again get caught like that. So they've become major creditors, creditor countries, with nearly all their surpluses being funneled into US bonds. And so this is sometimes called Bretton Woods II, or as Asia holds US bonds rather than gold-backed dollars, right? But the effect is very similar, right? That they're doing this for two reasons. When a US customer buys something buys something from one of these countries, right? The US customer sells US dollars and buys, South Korean won or whatever, right? And so that causes, or at least puts pressure in this direction, where it will make the dollar fall and the Korean won rise because there's demand for the Korean won. So this demand for Korean won would eventually make South Korean exports more expensive to buy in the US. So when the South Korean conglomerates or chaebols buy US bonds, they are selling the won and buying US dollars. So this demand for US dollars drives the dollar higher and the won lower. This makes Korean exports cheaper to buy in the US, and so maintains that export advantage. The second reason why, or the second effect of these countries buying US bonds, is that if they faced another currency crisis where short-term funds are withdrawn from their economies in a panic, that money flowing out of their economies will almost certainly go to the US market. It will flee into US bonds and maybe the US stock market. So the US dollar will skyrocket while the won falls, or their home currency falls. So if the Koreans sold their US bonds and shares and convert those dollars back into won, they make a massive profit just based on the currency exchange, and it will provide them liquidity to offset the funds that are being withdrawn. So it's a double whammy, right? However, there are two results from the massive inflows of capital to the market, or to the US market, I should say. So this recycling of trade surpluses back into US bonds has, the first effect is it drives asset prices higher, just as it did for the Southeast Asia. Since 1997, you had a drive up in asset prices in the US, and so you had a tech bubble that eventually burst in 1999 and caused a recession after that. Sorry, it burst in 2000. So inflows cause asset prices to rise. The other effect inflows like this have is by keeping the US dollar high, it makes imports cheaper and exports more expensive, and tends to make the trade balance move towards deficit, which is what has been happening in the US for some time. But if you look at 1997 on this graph, US trade deficits start a long slide into really massive deficits from 1997 onwards. Okay, so let's move on to China and talk about how they have gotten so rich so fast. So I don't need to go quite back to Ming Dynasty or anything, but I do want to just go back to the Qing Dynasty because the recent history is important for seeing where they've come from. So there's a democratic revolution in China in 1911, and the Qing Dynasty that has ruled China for like 300 years is toppled, and the first Chinese republic is declared. So the end of Chinese emperors, right? First time in, I don't know, 10,000 years, who knows? But so from 1911 onwards, we have the first Chinese republic declared. But it is in fact a mess of competing former army generals in what's known as the warlord era. And after 15 years of this, the Kuomintang, or the KMT leader, Chiang Kai-shek, and I'm butchering that, absolutely certainly I'm butchering that, but that's him on the bottom. So he leads an army of nationalists and some communists north to defeat the other warlords and unify the country. But he does this. He succeeds in unifying the country, but along the way he has a falling out with the communists, and he purges them and starts the Chinese Civil War. So the communists had almost lost this civil war, and they began a long retreat that becomes known as the Long March, as different parts of their army escape KMT forces, and they converge, and escaped through the mountainous regions. So that they had almost lost, right? And during this 370-day retreat, of the 100,000 or so troops that started, only 8,000 survived, right? So if they were almost defeated at the start of this retreat, they were properly defeated at the end. But then the Japanese invaded in 1937, and the KMT agreed to suspend the civil war while they fought the Japanese. And so in China, you'll hear that the communist forces defeated Japan, but that is not true at all. The KMT won a very costly victory over the Japanese. So it had badly weakened the KMT, but the communist forces were rearmed and restocked by the Soviet forces that were on their northern border. And so Mao was able to sweep down and beat back the KMT forces and drive them into a retreat to the island of Taiwan. Okay, so Mao follows the good Soviet economic playbook and nationalizes the farms and combines them into massive collectives. So 25,000 of them, each of them with about 5,000 families each. So, and they would have had big families, right? So you're probably talking about 25,000 people in each of these communes, right? So, and so Mao's had them do this collective farming, but he also they built backyard furnaces, which is the photos down the bottom, and these were supposed to pump out high quality steel for manufacturing, right? And surprisingly, they weren't able to produce any high quality steel, and the whole thing was a waste of time. Obviously, Mao didn't know how a steel furnace worked, but though, interestingly, the Chinese farmers didn't resist being put in collectives like the Russian farmers had, so there was much less bloodshed involved in that process. But as for being a great leap forward, it was certainly a great leap, but it was not forward. Just like Russia, China descends into a very bad famine because of just the inefficiencies of the collectives and the poor incentives, right? Everyone had an incentive to eat a lot but not work a lot. So between 1958 and 1961, somewhere between 25 and 55 million people starved to death. So pretty brutal times. This colossal mistake weakens Mao politically, as you would expect, right? And reformist pressures from moderates and academics and and others and his generals calling for moves to reform and maybe reopen the economy and move away from Soviet-style economic management and maybe towards more capitalist ideas. So in an effort to purge his political enemies, Mao declares these elites and intellectuals the enemy of the people and begins what he calls the Cultural Revolution. So Mao appeals to young people to rise up in violent revolution against the four olds. So the four olds are old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. Right? So very bad news if you were old in 1996 in China. So he he formed groups of young people that he called Red Guards and sent them out hunting for anyone displaying any of the four olds or capitalist thinking, or really anyone who had criticised Mao or the state that China was in. So initially it was school teachers and monks and university lecturers that were rounded up and killed, but it was the party elite and the Chinese generals that Mao really wanted purged, and party officials that weren't, necessarily loyal to him. So this rages for 10 years, and even lots of Red Guards fighting each other, as these extremist movements tend to, as they break down into who is the most ideologically pure. And Mao started sending the children of party officials and other elites to the countryside to be educated in the ways of the glorious farmer, right? The farmers being the only people with true revolutionary lifestyles, apparently. So after 10 years of this terror campaign, something like 8 million people are dead, and millions more have been beaten and removed from their jobs and sent to the collectives. And so really anyone who had any sort of skill or knowledge or ability was mowed down by roaming gangs of children and teenagers, right? So devastating time. So in the midst of this, taking the opportunity to drive a wedge into the gap that had formed between China and the Soviets, Russia had, or the Soviets had, thought twice about the help they were giving Mao and his nuclear program, and had withdrawn that help, and that had led to a falling out and some border clashes, and Mao was seeing the Soviets as a military threat on his border. So he invites Nixon, and Nixon visits in 1972, and but the Cultural Revolution didn't end really until Mao's death in 76. So in 76, the Cultural Revolution's over, Mao's dead, but Mao's really Mao has really destroyed Chinese culture, right? He wiped traditional Chinese culture away in the Cultural Revolution, right? What's there now is something different. So with Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping takes power, and he was a reformist and began making quite market-based reforms. And two of his famous quotes are, "Poverty is not socialism, right? To be rich is glorious." So very different to the ideological purity and extremism of Mao, especially in his late years. And another quote is, "It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white so long as it catches mice." So in other words, capitalism works, and that's all that matters. So while the initial steps in opening up were pretty small, they were momentous because of the change in direction, especially given the ideological fervour that had gone on before for so long. So I want to give you a sense of how amazingly shiny and new and advanced China's cities are now, right? I do quite a bit of teaching in China, and it's it's sometimes breathtaking how modern and new first-tier Chinese cities are. That they make New York look poor and dishevelled, right? So I can't do that with graphs, economic graphs. So let me play you a video.
Over the last 40 years, China has been transformed out of all recognition. The scale of its growth and the sheer speed of change is astonishing. Nothing like this has ever happened before. But as China rises, others will fall. In the 21st century, the balance of power in the world is changing. So how did an impoverished and backward communist country become an engine of global capitalism?
Just 40 years ago, China had a new leader, a 5-foot-tall, chain-smoking veteran of the Long March with a reputation for pragmatism over ideology, Deng Xiaoping. Under Deng, China renounced class struggle and embraced the market. It saw the biggest lifting of people out of poverty that has ever taken place in human history. China became a global economic force, predicted to become the world's biggest economy in a couple of decades.
So I don't actually agree with what he said about the world has never seen anything like it before. Certainly not on this scale. But the Asian tigers, South Korea was incredibly poor and in the space of 10 years, 15 years became a modern marvel. Japan, Taiwan, right? So, but nothing on the scale of China, right? And they've just got amazingly wealthy in 20 years, right? And you can imagine what that must be like for, or maybe you can't imagine what that must be like for, say, a 10-year-old in 2001 going from poverty to these shining brand new cities and tech jobs, right? When your father and grandfather and everyone used to live in a cave and be farmers, right? Between your 10th and your 30th birthday, the entire country has changed. So, okay, so how exactly did that happen, right? Yes, we know Deng Xiaoping brought in some reforms, but I just want to go into a little bit more detail. Okay, so a key event was Tiananmen Square, the protests there in 1989. And in the same year, the Soviet Union breaks up, right? So this scares the conservative forces inside the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and this allows Deng Xiaoping to ram through quite really pro-capitalist policies that are focused on export-orientated growth, right? So he's following the same strategy as the export-orientated industrialization of South Korea and Taiwan, etc. And his argument was that look at what's happening. Soviet Union is disintegrating. Our people are protesting in the streets. If we don't change, we're going to see revolution, right? Our heads will end up on spikes. So he forces these market reforms through, but he's not just the good guy in this story, right? He sent tanks in and crushed the pro-democracy movement, killed an estimated 10,000 protesters in what is called, quite rightly, the Tiananmen Square Massacre. Right? So that's how the reformist wing of the Communist Party got the upper hand, right? But back to the economic story. Import substitution focused state-owned enterprises, right, have all gone broke in China by the late 1980s, and this left the Shenzhen industrial area, so that's the massive city, full of empty factories and warehouses that the local authorities are trying to lease out, right? And lease out very cheaply. So there's all this infrastructure just sitting there idle. So that's one ingredient. The next ingredient is just the endless supply of cheap labour, right? 700 million unemployed workers available in the countryside who all want to escape the crushing poverty of farm life, right? Like, this is, being a farmer is not a nice job, right? Like, and they work hard, and they put up with terrible conditions and are paid very little, but it's still better than being stuck on the farm, right? The next ingredient is that Guangzhou is declared a free trade zone in 1990, and this what this meant for a businessman is that you could import machines, so say second-hand sewing machines, right? You could buy them and import them with zero tariffs, right? And no export, no import fees or anything like that. And you could sew your t-shirts or whatever and export them through the hyper-efficient and cheap Hong Kong port that was only a 40-minute boat ride away from Shenzhen. And you could sell all your t-shirts with zero taxes, right? So Hong Kong is a tax haven to start with, and it doesn't tax earnings that are made outside Hong Kong. So Hong Kong was the door that all sort of Chinese trade to the outside world went through. And the Tiananmen Square Massacre was important not just for allowing these openings, this capitalist sort of turn to be forced through by Deng Xiaoping, but it also caused the US and the EU to ban any of their citizens or companies investing in China. So, and this fed into the panic of local authorities that reduced the price of leasing land in Shenzhen to basically zero, and were offering, 10-year, 15-year, 30-year leases, right, for zero. So the first through the door was Hong Kong business magnates, right, that are looking for cheap real estate, cheap, factory floors and more labour. Plus, so because of the US and EU bans on any investment, but that doesn't apply to Hong Kong businessmen or Japanese or South Korean businessmen, right? Or even Taiwanese, right? They don't face any of those restrictions, but they're benefiting from the price decline that they cause. So, to put this in terms, in bottom line terms, in the 1990s, you could set up a small factory in Shenzhen, all up, for less than $30,000 Australian. Right? You could have a factory of, 500 workers pumping out jeans or something, right? with virtually no rent, and the money you earn is virtually tax-free. So Hong Kong business people first through the door, and then Taiwanese, but then because of the Plaza and Louvre Accords, the Japanese yen strengthens against the US dollar really significantly, and puts a lot of the manufacturing in Japan out of business, right? Because their exports are just too expensive now and can't compete in the US market or EU market. So Japanese manufacturers moved to China to get around the Accords' high currency. So this, in particular, the Japanese move, this brings in really advanced manufacturing, and in particular, highly skilled designers, engineers, and managers. The Japanese were the leaders of the world, manufacturing at that time, right? And so all of that skill base, all of the high-end skill base, gets transplanted from Japan and Taiwan into Guangdong free trade area, right? Shenzhen in particular, where everything, including labor and taxes and real estate, and is all exponentially cheaper, right? Plus, Deng Xiaoping is building infrastructure, ports and roads and airports to make the movement of goods cheaper and quicker and easier. And that's without even going into the subsidies that export-orientated industrialization tends to use, right, to encourage exports. Then the next thing that happened was that in 1994, under pressure from lots of US manufacturers, Bill Clinton decides to delink human rights issues from economic ones. Right, so because of Tiananmen Square, all these sanctions had gone on, all these investment bans had gone on to China, and so in 1994 he is persuaded to delink human rights issues from economic ones, and lifts the trade barriers to direct US investment. And following his decision, the EU does as well. So foreign direct investment, right? So investment by US and European businessmen just goes through the roof, right? So this is the beginning of the end for US manufacturing, really. So that's 1994, and you've already got this rush of foreign direct investment into China, particularly Japan. But then in 2001, China is admitted to the World Trade Organization, which means it gets most favored nation's tariff level from every country, but is able to keep its own tariffs very high because its lowest tariff, right, its most favored nation tariff, given to someone else, is still really high, right? So there's a huge advantage being a late admission to the WTO, though they did have to make a whole lot of promises about getting rid of their state-owned enterprises and cutting their subsidies and opening their domestic market to foreigners. And Bill Clinton actually argued that the US was essentially getting something for nothing, right? So let me read a quote. He says, "Economically, this agreement is the equivalent of a one-way street. It requires China to open its markets with a fifth of the world's population, potentially the biggest market in the world, to open that to both our producers and services in unprecedented new ways. All we do is maintain the present access which China enjoys. So the Clinton administration argued that admitting China to the WTO would decrease the US's trade deficit with China, right? Like that was one of the arguments. This would decrease their deficit by allowing US firms to compete in China, right? So amazing, amazing how wrong that was in hindsight, right? To be fair, what Clinton didn't expect was the massive shifting of US firms manufacturing to China, right? So this offshoring began an accelerated collapse of US manufacturing employment. And we see, these megastores like Walmart and Kmart replacing all the small shops in every town in the US by selling cheap Chinese goods. Right? Really restructures the US economy. And Clinton and his advisors, including Paul Krugman, was very wrong about WTO admittance shrinking the trade deficit. So from 2001, from joining the World Trade Organization, the trade deficit just explodes. So definitely wrong in that prediction. And it's not just doing cheap knockoffs, right? Not anymore anyway. China is now a leader in patents of new designs and technologies. And even from the beginning, Japan and Taiwan used to be cheap knockoffs, right? And they had to climb the technology sort of ladder. But even from the beginning, all of that expertise was transplanted to China and in the 90s, right? So the takeoff has even been quicker, right? But there's certainly a lead. You know, they make the best laptop, they make the best phones. There's real debate as to how big the technology gap is between China and the US, right? I would think it is much less than most people would think, right? And even the trade war has forced, so in transistors, in computer chips, the Chinese market relied on Cisco and these other American manufacturers of chips. But because of the trade war has cut that trade, it's forced them to develop their own, and they've developed them really quickly. So, trade war has had unintended consequences. Okay, so while you might hear quite often that the US is still the largest economy and the Chinese won't be there for a couple of decades, like that video said, that's only if you convert the Chinese GDP, which is obviously measured in yuan, into US dollars, right? And why would you do that? If you are the Chinese government, you buy virtually everything you use in Chinese yuan, right? So if you compare the GDPs in terms of how much stuff China can buy in China and how much stuff the US can buy in the US, so this is called comparing purchasing power parity. So comparing their purchasing power, because China's prices are so much lower, their economy became the largest in the world, with the US in second place in 2015, if you are comparing purchasing power parity. And China has a dynamism that is pulling in the world's entrepreneurs, right? Almost all the tone of discussion about the rise of China that we get coming out of the US and in a lot of the Australian press at the moment is one of danger and fear, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Let me play a more positive clip for you.
There's a flourishing scene here for hardware startups that want to move fast and make things. Many of them can be found here at a startup incubator called Hacks. The idea here is simple. Help startups build a prototype, then connect them with factories that can start cranking out their products by the thousands. Take Jamie here, an affable chap who's part of a British startup called Carve.
We make a digital ski coach. So effectively, it's like a insert you put into your ski boot, and it teaches you how to ski better. So you get like real-time feedback through headphones, like that was a bad turn, that was a bad turn, that was a better turn.
You have one here, don't you?
Yeah, let me show you. So yeah, these are motion sensors.
Okay,
so we have full
that's spot on.
motion sensing.
Crazy. Like many startups here, Carve began life as a humble Kickstarter campaign. Now, just a couple of years later, they're pumping out 5,000 units of their product every month. Do you think you could have brought something like this to life in the UK if you'd have been accepted by an incubator there?
Yeah,
or
I mean,
now that you've been here, you've seen a new world, I guess?
I think it kind of depends a little bit on how much of a shoestring you're on. Here in Shenzhen, it's so much cheaper. In many different categories, it's cheaper, like in the product development phase, to get different materials 3D printed or machined. You get it here for kind of half the cost and twice as fast.
Yep.
And sometimes 7 times as fast.
To get a feel for that high-speed energy, I hop across the street with Jamie to the famed Washong Bay markets.
Yeah, so this is the biggest electronics market in the world, probably.
They're an important resource for the young entrepreneurs here, and a fantastic place to get your senses overloaded. Such a hive of activity in here. It's crazy.
Oh man, it's great. So this is the energy, right? You just walk through the market, it's like bang.
Yeah.
You know, like, okay. This is where factories have come to display their wares to potential buyers, who is me and a lot of the other people here. Kind of a storefront for factories.
Okay. And if I make like smartphones or TVs or anything like that, I kind of come here to see the latest and greatest stuff.
Exactly. You want to find a manufacturer, you come to Huaqiang Bay.
It's also a great place to find that missing part for your prototype, which is why you run into other crews from Hacks roaming the aisles.
Buying some screws? Buying some springs. Have you tried, there's a spring woman out the front as well if you want one. Just on the left as you go out.
I used to have a guy just there, but he doesn't want to sell them anymore.
The fact that I can get a component in like an hour is like absolutely phenomenal. That is Shenzhen speed.
Yeah.
That's why we're here.
Here's how Shenzhen works. You put up a damn things are going well here skyscraper. And then you put up another one right next to it, because you can. And then to really drive the point home, you do all of this next to a metallurgic marvel of a stadium. We're talking about a boom town the likes of which the world has never seen before.
So exciting stuff for startups, right? And China's got a big push on at the moment called Made in China 2025, where in the vein of export-orientated stuff, they're getting subsidies and government benefits to develop these high-tech industries that they want to be world leaders of in 2025. Right? And so the rise of China, I mean, I don't really see any reason why they won't be world leaders in this stuff And so the rise of China's been earth-shaking in more ways than one. And it doesn't really matter if the Chinese Communist Party reforms or falls apart or stays strong. China, as an economic powerhouse and rival maybe, but a huge presence in the international political economy, that's not going away, right? There's no solution here in terms of China going away, right? We need to work out how to live with this and manage it and benefit from it. And hopefully it isn't something that we always need to be scared of. I mean, if you're wanting to start a, manufacturing or a tech startup, you're going to go to Shenzhen, right? You're not going to go to New York. So hopefully that's a more positive spin on the normal China threat story that you hear. Anyway, hopefully you found that interesting, and I'll speak to you in the next lecture.